Chuck Norris couldn't or wouldn't do. The 86-year-old, long deemed invincible, has died suddenly, leaving his legion of fans in shock.
9 days before the world lost him, an 86-year-old man stood under the Hawaiian sun, throwing punches like time had no power over him. He smiled, calm, almost defiant, and wrote just a few words. "I don't age, I level up. No one knew." Those words would become his final message. 9 days later, he was gone. And what happened after his death, no one was prepared for. Because this wasn't just the passing of a legend. This was the quiet ending of a life filled with strength, secrets, love, and sacrifices no one truly understood. It started with a phone call, March 19, 2026. A normal day turned into something no one in his family could ever forget. He had been staying at his oceanfront home in Hawaii, a place filled with peace, memories, and the kind of silence he had earned after decades of fame. But that morning, something wasn't right. He was rushed to the hospital. There was no warning, no long goodbye, no dramatic final speech. Just hours later, he was gone. 86 years of life ended in a single day. For years, the internet had played with his death like a joke. Fake headlines, viral hoaxes, rumors that came and went. People had already lost him many times before, but this time, it was real, and somehow, that made it harder to believe. His family didn't say much. No dramatic statements, no details about what happened. Just one quiet message: thank you for loving him. Not for watching him. Not for cheering him, but for loving him. And that one sentence said everything. Because behind the strength, behind the image, behind the legend, there was a man who just wanted to be loved. Within hours, tributes flooded in. Celebrities, politicians, fans from all over the world. Everyone had something to say, but none of it compared to what his family felt. Because while the world saw a legend, they lost a husband, a father, a man who had quietly carried more pain than anyone ever realized. And as people began talking about his legacy, one question came up again and again: what did he leave behind? The answer shocked many: around $70 million, a fortune built over decades, movies, television, businesses, endorsements, a lifetime of work turned into numbers on paper. But the truth is, that number doesn't tell his story, because everything he built almost didn't exist at all. Long before the money, before the fame, before the world knew his name, he was just a boy, a quiet, insecure kid growing up in a broken home. He wasn't strong, he wasn't confident, he wasn't special. At least, that's what he believed. He described himself as shy, nervous, invisible. His father struggled with alcohol. His home was unstable. Life felt uncertain every single day. And when his father was gone, things felt calmer. That alone tells you everything. They moved constantly, chasing survival, not dreams. And no one, not a single person, looked at that boy and thought, he's going to become a legend. Because there was nothing about him that stood out until one moment changed everything. He joined the Air Force. Not because he had a plan, but because he didn't. And that's where he found something that would redefine his entire life: martial arts. At first, it was just curiosity. Then it became obsession. For hours a day. Every day, training, failing, learning, repeating. For the first time in his life, he felt something different. He felt capable. And that feeling changed everything. Because once someone realizes they can become stronger, they never go back to who they were before. That quiet boy slowly disappeared, and in his place, a fighter was born. Years later, that fighter would become a champion, a teacher, a businessman, and eventually, a star. But even then, success didn't come easy. When he entered the world of film, no one believed in him. No one thought he could act. No one thought he could carry a movie. He was rejected, ignored, dismissed, but he kept going because he had already learned something most people never do. Hard things are worth fighting for. And then, everything changed. One opportunity. One role. One moment that introduced him to the world. From there, his rise was unstoppable. Movies, fame, recognition. But it wasn't just about success. It was about control. He built his career his way. He chose His image, his values, his message, strong, disciplined, moral. To the world, he became more than an actor. He became a symbol, but symbols aren't real people. And behind that image, there were things no one knew, secrets that stayed hidden for decades. One of them would shock even his biggest fans, a daughter he never knew existed for years. She lived her life without him, not because she didn't care, but because she was told not to reach out. And for decades, she did in single quotes until one day, she did. She wrote him a letter. And when they finally met, everything changed. He saw her and instantly knew. No test, no proof, just a feeling. They both broke down. Years of distance erased in a single moment. And what he said later became one of the most powerful things he ever expressed. There are no illegitimate children, only parents who make mistakes. That moment showed a different side of him. Not a fighter, not a legend, just a man facing his past and choosing love. But life wasn't done testing him. Years later, he faced something far worse. His wife became seriously ill. What started as a routine medical procedure turned into a nightmare. Pain, suffering, confusion. Doctors couldn't explain it. Tests came back normal, but she was getting worse, and he could see it. The fear, the pain, the helplessness. He knew something was wrong, even when no one else believed it. So he made a choice. He stepped away from everything. Movies, fame, career, none of it mattered anymore. Only one thing did, saving her. He stayed by her side for months, reading to her, caring for her, refusing to give up. He spent millions trying to find answers. Flew across countries, searched for anything that could help, because for him, love wasn't just words. It was action. It was sacrifice. It was staying when walking away would have been easier. Eventually, she survived, but that experience changed him forever. He was no longer just a public figure. He was a man who had fought a battle no one saw. And won. When he returned to his life, it was different. Quieter. More focused on family. Less about fame, more about meaning. And maybe that's why his final years felt so peaceful, living on his ranch, spending time with his children, watching life slow down. After decades of moving fast. Until that final trip to Hawaii. Until that final video. Until those final words. I don't age, I level up. Looking back now, it feels different. Almost like he knew, almost like he was saying goodbye in his own way. And now, everything he built is being passed on. His family, his children, his legacy. But the real question isn't about money. It's not about fame. It's not about the image the world created. It's about who he really was. A boy who felt invisible. A man who built himself from nothing, a father who made mistakes and tried to make them right, a husband who refused to give up on love, a fighter, not just in movies, but in life. And maybe that's why his family didn't ask people to remember his films. They asked something much simpler. Much deeper. Thank you for loving him. Because in the end, that's all any of us really leave behind. Not the money, not the fame. Not the image. Just the love people felt for us. And the lives we touched along the way. So now the question is, how will you remember him? What makes a man unforgettable? Is it the fights he wins, the fame he builds, or the life he lives when no one is watching? Because in the final days of his life, none of that looked the way people expected. There were no cameras. No crowds. No applause. Just the quiet sound of the ocean and a man who had already given everything he had to the world. After that final video in the Hawaiian sun, something shifted. Those close to him noticed it. He wasn't weak. He wasn't afraid, but there was a calmness about him that felt different. Like a man who had already made peace with everything behind him. He spent more time sitting outside, watching the waves roll in and out. Not saying much. Just thinking, and sometimes smiling, because when you've lived a life like his, silence becomes something meaningful. You don't need noise anymore. You don't need validation. You don't need to prove anything. You just exist with everything you've been through. And that's where he was. Not the action hero, not the unstoppable fighter, just a man at peace. But even in those quiet moments, his past never really left him. Because the truth is, you don't build a life like his without carrying something heavy inside. There were losses that stayed with him, his mother, his first wife, people who were once part of his everyday life. Gone within months of each other, that kind of loss doesn't just disappear. It settles deep. And for a man who spent his life appearing strong, those were the moments that tested him the most. Because strength isn't about fighting others. It's about facing yourself when everything falls apart, and yet, he never let the world see that side. He kept showing up as the man people believed him to be. Reliable, strong, unshaken, but behind closed doors. He was human, he felt everything. And maybe that's what makes his story so powerful. Because it wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. It wasn't some straight path to success. It was messy. It was painful. It was real, and that's something people don't talk about enough. They see the success, but not the struggle. They see the image, but not the truth. They see the legend, but not the man. And in his case, the man was far more interesting than the legend ever was, because he didn't just build a career. He built himself piece by piece, failure by failure, choice by choice. Every setback became something he used to move forward. Every doubt became something he proved wrong, and every challenge became something he refused to run from. That's not something you're born with. That's something you become, and it takes a lifetime. There were moments when everything could have gone differently. Moments when he could have quit. Moments when he could have chosen an easier path. But he didn't. Because once you've discovered your purpose, walking away from it feels worse than failing at it. And he understood that better than most. Even when Hollywood didn't fully accept him, even when critics doubted him, even when opportunities didn't come easy, he kept going. Not because it was guaranteed to work, but because he refused to stop. And eventually, that persistence turned into something undeniable, a career that lasted decades, a presence that people recognized instantly, a name that became bigger than the roles he played. But success has a strange way of changing how people see you. The more famous you become, the less people see who you really are. They see what they expect. They see what they want. They see the version of you that fits the story in their head. And for him, that meant becoming something almost myth-like. Unbreakable. Fearless. Larger than life. But no one is truly like that. And he knew it, which is why he chose to step away. Not completely, but enough to reclaim something he had lost. Privacy. Time. Connection. Things that matter more than fame, but often come at the cost of it. On his ranch, life was different. Slower. Simpler. Real. There were no scripts. No cameras. No expectations. Just family. Just life. And maybe that's where he found his greatest success. Not in the movies. Not in the business deals. But in the moments no one ever saw. The conversations, the laughter, the quiet mornings, the feeling of being present without needing to be anything else. Because at the end of everything, that's what stays. Not the highlights, not the headlines, just the moments that felt real. And he had plenty of those. Especially with his children. Each of them carried a different part of his story, different experiences. Different memories, but all connected by one thing. Him. A father who wasn't perfect, but who tried. Who showed up. Who made mistakes, and then chose to face them. That matters more than people realize, because being there matters, even when it's not easy, even when it's complicated, even when it takes years to fix what was once broken. And he did that. In his own way. In his own time, which makes his story feel complete. Not because everything went perfectly, but because he didn't run from what mattered most. And when his final day came, there was no chaos, no long struggle. No drawn-out goodbye, just a quiet ending to a very loud life. And sometimes that's the most meaningful kind of ending. There is. Because it reflects something deeper. Acceptance. Peace. Closure. Things that can't be forced, only earned, and he earned them through everything he went through everything he became, through everything he chose to face. Now, as the world looks back on his life, people will argue about his career. His beliefs, his legacy. That always happens. But those debates don't define him. Because the truth is never found in headlines. It's found in the details. The small moments. The choices no one sees. And in his case, those are the things that matter most. A man who started with nothing, who built everything, who lost, who loved, who fought, who stayed, and who, in the end, left quietly. Without needing one last spotlight. Because he didn't need it. He had already done enough. And maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. You don't need to be perfect to be remembered. You don't need to be flawless to be respected. You just need to live honestly. To face what comes your way. To hold on to what matters. And to let go of what doesn't. That's what he did. And that's why his story won't fade. Because it isn't just about him. It's about something bigger. Something everyone understands. Even if they don't realize it. The desire to matter. To be seen. To be remembered, not for what you had, but for who you were. And in that sense, he didn't just leave behind a legacy. He left behind a feeling, something people will carry long after the headlines disappear. So when you think about him now, don't just think about the fights. Don't just think about the fame. Think about the journey, the struggles, the choices, the moments that shaped everything, because that's where the real story is, and maybe that's where you'll find something of your own too. Because every life, no matter how big or small, has a story worth telling. And his was one that the world will never forget. And maybe the most powerful part of his story is what didn't happen in front of the world. Because when the cameras stopped, when the fame slowed down, when the noise faded, that's when the real story began. There's something people don't understand about legends. They think greatness is loud. They think it's constant. They think it never stops. But the truth is, the strongest people often choose silence. And in his later years, that's exactly what he chose. Not because he had nothing left to give, but because he had finally given enough. He had spent decades proving himself, fighting battles, building a name, carrying expectations, and at some point, he realized something simple. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. That realization changes a person. It shifts how you see everything. Success becomes quieter. Happiness becomes simpler, and time becomes more valuable than anything else. That's why he stepped back, not out of weakness, but out of understanding. Because he knew something most people learn too late. You can chase the world your entire life and still miss the moments that actually matter. So he chose differently. He chose presence. He chose family. He chose a life that didn't need validation. And in doing so, he became something even stronger than before. Not a fighter, but a man who understood himself. But even in that peace, life still had one more test waiting for him. Because no matter how strong you are, no matter how much you've overcome, there are moments that hit differently. Moments that force you to stop. To feel, to face things you can't control. And for him, those moments came one after another. Lost. Silence. Change, the kind of experiences that don't make headlines, but shape everything inside you. And yet, he never let bitterness take over. He never turned cold. He never gave up on what he believed in. Instead, he held on tighter. To his values. To his faith. To the people who mattered most. That says a lot about a person, because it's easy to stay strong when things are going well. But staying strong when everything is falling apart, that's different. That's real strength. And that's who he was. Not perfect, not invincible, but consistent. Grounded. Unshaken in the things that matter. And maybe that's why his story connects with so many people. Because deep down, everyone is fighting something. Everyone has moments where they feel lost, where they feel uncertain, where they wonder if they're strong enough to keep going. And stories like his remind us that strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you build through pain, through failure, through showing up, even when it's hard. And he showed up. Again and again, even when no one was watching, even when it didn't benefit him, even when it would have been easier to stop. That kind of consistency, that kind of discipline, that kind of mindset, that's what separates people. Not talent, not luck, not opportunity, but the decision to keep going. And he made that decision every single time. Until one day, there were no more decisions too. Make dot just a quiet ending, a final moment, a life that had run its course, and what's left now isn't just a legacy dot, it's a reflection of what's possible, of what it means to grow dot, to change, to become something more than what you started as, because if a shy, uncertain boy from a broken home could build a life like that, then what does that say about everyone else? What does that say about you? Maybe more than you think. Maybe his story isn't just something to watch. Maybe it's something to learn from, because at its core, it's not about fame dot, it's not about money. It's not about recognition dot, it's about growth, becoming better dot, stronger dot, wiser, more aware of what truly matters, and that's something anyone can do dot, at any stage dot, at any point dot, no matter where they start. That's the real message, hidden beneath everything else, and maybe that's why his final words feel so powerful now. I don't age, I level up. At first, it sounds confident dot, almost playful, but looking back, it feels deeper dot, like a summary of his entire life, because he never stopped growing. He never stopped evolving. He never stayed the same, and that's what made him who he was. Not the fights dot, not the fame, but the mindset, the refusal to stay stuck, the decision to keep becoming, and now, that journey has ended, but the impact hasn't, because stories like this don't disappear, they stay. They echo dot, they inspire, long after everything else fades. So maybe the real question isn't, what did he leave behind? Maybe the real question is, what will you take from it? Will you remember the image or the truth? Will you focus on the surface or the depth? Because there's a difference, and that difference changes everything dot. In the end, he wasn't just a name. He wasn't just a figure people admired. He was a reminder of what it means to rise dot, to fall dot, to fight dot, to love dot, to lose, and to keep going anyway. That's what makes a life meaningful, not perfection, not success, but persistence dot, and he had that until the very end. So as the world moves on, as new stories take over, as time continues forward, this one won't disappear, because it's not just about him dot, it's about something universal, something human dot, something real dot, and that's why it matters, that's why it stays. That's why it will always be remembered dot, not as just another story, but as a life that proved something important. That no matter where you start, no matter what you face, no matter how many times you doubt yourself, you can still become something more, and maybe that's the legacy that matters most.